to another episode of Unlocking California Politics. My name is Sanjay Wagle. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the California Association of Realtors. And today we are joined by two returning guests, Assemblymember Joe Patterson and Josh Hoover, to recap their first term as elected officials in the California State Legislature. Assemblymember Joe Patterson holds a real estate broker license and was elected to the State Assembly in 2022 to represent Placer and El Dorado counties. Before that, he served as the Rockland City Council and as mayor in 2019. He started his career in the state legislature as a legislative director before transitioning to the private sector and launching his own business in 2019. He is currently the vice chair of the Housing and Community Development Committee and a member of the Assembly Budget and Insurance Committees, among others. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, those are some powerful committees there, or important to, very important for our industry committees there. Next, I would like to welcome Assemblymember Josh Hoover. He was elected to the California State Assembly in November of 2022, representing the 7th District, which includes Citrus Heights, Folsom, Rancho Cordova, and surrounding areas in Sacramento County. He previously worked as Chief of Staff in the State Assembly and is a former school board member. He is the Vice Chair of the Assembly Committee on Jobs, Economic Development, and the Economy, and a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bipartisan group trying to promote bipartisan solutions. And very importantly, he represents the district in which I am in.
That is correct.
so that's very important to me. All right. So your first legislative session is over, and we're now waiting for the governor to sign or veto the bills that are passed by the legislature. Given the supermajority, the legislature can be challenging for Republicans. But nonetheless, we know that both of you have managed to advance and move forward with some of your priorities. And can you share what you think have been some of your biggest accomplishments this term? We'll start with you, Assemblymember Patterson.
Yeah, well, it's been, I think the second year for me anyways was a lot better than the first year. Just getting to know, this is kind of a relationship business, other than the policy and things like that. The relationships are really important. And so I think that took some time to develop. But so, for example, I have some bills sitting on the governor's desk that I tried the first year, and the second year, they're awaiting his fate. So one of them, I was able to get a piece of legislation out on fentanyl that actually could result in increased criminal penalties. And so that was, I don't know of any other piece of legislation that passed this session that could add criminal penalties to fentanyl. So that was a good thing. And then also I've been working a lot with trying to help a very specific group of individuals that have developmental disabilities and just red tape and bureaucracy. Again, the first year we didn't even get a hearing on the bill. And then this year we have one waiting on the desk that will hopefully solve the problem. So I think it was a pretty good couple of years. But like I said, I think it just takes time to develop relationships. And even if you don't really agree with the people, just kind of mutual respect, I guess, even though some of their ideas are crazy, but they probably say that about mine too. So.
How about you, Assemblymember Hoover?
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting, really eye-opening. I think to Joe's point, a lot of it does come down to building those relationships. I think there were a couple times actually where I actually had bill proposals that were kind of quietly taken by the other side and run as their own bills. I think Joe might have had that experience as well. And, in some ways it's kind of flattering because you're like, well, at least we know that they liked our legislation, right? But we were able to get some really, I think, key things done. And I think the biggest is in my first year in 2023, we passed a bipartisan audit of homelessness spending in California.
That's right.
Really got, that report came out in April and really got to the core of the problem, which is we've spent nearly 24 billion taxpayer dollars. We've seen a 32% increase in homelessness statewide. And more troubling, we don't really know where any of the money went, which is a big problem, right? So we actually put forward a bill this year to implement the auditor's recommendations on homelessness. Essentially just require that the state track and measure any dollars that they spend on homelessness in California. Not really a crazy concept. And something I think should have been happening all along. But we did get that across the finish line. It's sitting on the governor's desk, and we're hoping that he signs it. But, I do think that to your question about Republicans in the legislature, I mean, there are ways to be effective. And I think Joe and I have found ways to do that. And it requires working with the other side, but I think we're both, have had a lot of success with that.
Right, and it's interesting you mentioned that homelessness bill because I think there was a hearing forget when exactly recently, where basically they sort of admitted we don't know where the money went. and
Yeah, it's pretty troubling to say the least. Yeah.
Now, we first talked back in April of 2023, and you've both now completed an entire session. So, and Assemblymember Patterson, you mentioned personal relationships as something that you realized that the importance of, or it highlighted the importance of that. So, but if you could both talk to us about your experience and what was surprised you, what was unexpected that you maybe didn't think about before you started or got into office. And we'll start with Assemblymember Hoover.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I will say there are a lot of personalities, right? And, me coming from a school board of 5 people where you really just need to convince 2 other people to join your side if you want to get something done. Now being in a body of 120 people, and being in the, up against it from a political standpoint sometimes. But there's a lot of personalities. And I think that has been, trying to get to know even 79 of my colleagues, well enough to work with them is definitely a big undertaking. But what I would say is that there are a lot of great people in the legislature. There are some people that are hard to get along with, but overall, everyone came up here, right, to represent their communities, to be a voice for their constituents, and to get some things done. And I think at the end of the day, if you're all going at it from that mindset, you can definitely find areas of common ground, and that's kind of what we've been trying to do.
Assemblymember Patterson.
I think about I used to be an intern and then staffed here for a while. As you mentioned, it's been 13 years or so since I was a staff person, almost 14. So a lot has changed, particularly the makeup of the legislature. But it's what we really, first of all, the end of session, everything that happened at the end of session was intense and very surprising. And just from what I've talked with people who've been around for a while, that was kind of one of the worst. Cutting off debate,
Right.
But really the dysfunction between the houses and the governor's office. I think that's something that's been boiling over for a while, to be honest with you. But I'm not surprised that different branches of government would see things differently. That's how actually the democracy should work. But I'm really kind of surprised. Just to be completely candid, really surprised at how things get pushed sort of onto the legislature at the last moment, and then it's expected that the legislature will pass it out. And equally surprised and impressed with the legislature saying, no, we're not going to do that right now, And I think that's what a healthy democracy actually needs, although the end of session was insanity. It was insanity. But so we're going into special session now,
Right.
as you know,
Right.
and I don't really think it's a special session anybody in the state of California is even thinking about. But this is one of those things that's happening because the legislature, I believe, said, no, we're not going to jam this through on the last week of session.
Right. Right. The pieces of legislation
Yeah.
in the last minute.
Yeah.
Assemblymember Hoover, any comments about end of session?
Yeah, it was insane. It's weird. This was, I guess, both of our first time in the final week of legislative session. Now, in your first year of legislative session, you have an end of session, but there's not really a hard constitutional deadline, right? And so when, this being our first time really being on the floor for the hard constitutional deadline, which is essentially midnight on September 1st, it really creates a lot of dramatic things because everyone, I keep calling the legislature like procrastinating college students, because for some reason we've got months and months and months of time to pass these bills, and yet we save like this huge tranche of bills for the final hour of legislative session. And so we're sitting there, trying to debate on bills that affect our communities. There were some major pieces of legislation in these grouping of bills. We've got 1 hour left, and we're told, well, we can't really debate them because we're out of time. Well, my thought process on that is that's not our fault, right? We didn't have to be out of time here. And so it's kind of a position that was created, by the powers that be. But I just think we need to do a better job in the future and make sure that that never happens again. I mean, let's manage our time better, and let's just do a better job, on the front end. Really, just not procrastinating until the last minute.
Yeah. Now, last time we talked about how, despite obvious ideological differences that exist, sometimes being very dramatic between members of the two parties, relations are generally civil in terms of interaction, which is different than a lot of states where there are supermajorities on one side or the other, and especially compared to DC, where we do an annual trip and we meet with our legislators from the state of California. And we have some Republicans and Democrats who, were served in the state legislature and then moved to Congress. And they're like, yeah, when we would talk to each other, Democrat and Republican, other members of our caucus were like, why are you guys talking? You shouldn't be talking to each other. You're, what's happening here? How would you talk about that interaction between Democrats and Republicans within the legislature? And I'll start with you, Assemblymember Patterson.
I mean, it really is different for every person, every one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I mean, I like to think I get along with most of them. Some of them some of them I prefer to have lunch with more than others,
Sure.
And I'm sure they'd say
Of
the same thing
course.
about me. But
Mhm.
it is very civil. I think sometimes it can get out of hand. I definitely think they flex, but also I think on a lot of things, Republicans use an extraordinary amount of restraint, especially when it comes to things that we are just philosophically opposed
Mhm.
to. I remember, when I was a staff person, and every year Republicans would introduce a resolution to honor Ronald Reagan. I mean, a
Mhm.
former governor and a president of the United States, right?
Right.
And the Democrats would stand up and basically just shame him, in their speeches, and Republicans would just, do their resolution but they just talk about how evil of a guy he was in their view and things like that. I mean, there are resolutions that we vote on a maybe weekly basis, at least a monthly basis, that are philosophically, I think, have some things that are very reprehensible in it, but we don't get up there and, sort of shame
Mhm.
the other side or whatever they're honoring. We actually sit back there and let them do sort of what they want to do, what they came to do, and kind of pay that respect. And I think that kind of needs to be a two-way street,
Okay.
on various things. And, I think for the most part it is, but I will say at the end of the day, when it comes to substantive policy, if you're a legitimate policymaker and you really want to make change, I mean, I can go to basically any of my colleagues and say like, "Hey, here's what I'm trying to do," and they may not agree, and then that is what it is. But I've had a lot of controversial issues where they are totally open to working with me on it, and I do appreciate that at the end of the day. I mean, that's what we're here to do. And so I think my experience, although there's a lot of noise with crazy stuff
Mhm.
going on out there, and mostly the public only hears about a lot of the
Right.
crazy stuff.
Mhm.
But I think for the most part, I mean, if you are bringing a serious attitude to it, you at least can have a conversation on the issue. And that has benefited my district. I mean, I have some bills on economic development and things like that were recommended, you know, by a consultant, for example, not to
Mhm.
move forward. But I was able to talk that through with the chair and then the committee
Oh,
consultant. So
okay.
I think, there's legitimate discussions that go on 90% of issues that go through this place.
Oh, that's great to hear, actually. Assemblymember Hoover?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we're living in this age of hyperpartisanship that has created this sort of weird situation where you have to somehow not get along or not be able to be friends with someone on the other side of the aisle. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think that hasn't really been the history of our politics in the
Mhm.
United States. I mean, if you look, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you look back like 50 years, Gallup has been doing this poll for many years where they ask, like, do you care if your daughter or your son
Oh,
marries
right.
someone from the other side of the aisle? And for years and years and years, everyone, most people just didn't care. It wasn't something that really factored into a
Mhm.
personal relationship issue. That has changed substantially in the last few years, where we're seeing more and more that people are like, no, I will only marry a Republican or I'll only marry a Democrat. And I think that's really unfortunate because, I really do think there is a lot of common ground there. But even beyond that, it's okay to disagree on things. I think
Right.
that's kind of how our system is set up. We're supposed to have these respectful disagreements and hash these things out in policy. And so, I would say from my perspective, and again, I think to Joe's point, it does depend on the individual. But there are a number of folks in the legislature on both sides of the aisle that want to bring that back to a degree where we are, leaving it on the field, so to speak,
Okay.
and,
Right.
having cordial relationships afterwards. That's one of the reasons I joined the Problem Solvers Caucus, because that is one place where we can go and eat lunch together and talk about bipartisan solutions. And, when we're in those meetings together, we have a lot of great conversations and a lot of agreement on, yeah, we need to do better in California and we need to lead better in a bipartisan fashion. I wish there were more members that were willing to come to that table. There's only 20 of us in the Problem Solvers
Right.
Caucus
Oh, that's not a bad
out of
number.
120.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, I would love to see that number grow and continue to invite people to the table where, this isn't just about partisanship.
I'm not a problem solver.
You're
I'm
a
never
problem
going to be a
causer.
member of that caucus.
Um, so going to housing. Housing remains a critical issue for Californians to resolve. Assemblymember Patterson, you are the vice chair of the Housing Committee. Can you share any movement forward that you think could further encourage housing? It sometimes feels like people want to kind of take a pause. We've passed a lot of legislation in the state and see how it all plays out before moving forward, or do you think there's more that can be done, in the near future for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we can do, but I think we're sort of reaching, unfortunately, close to the end of the runway on things that can happen legislatively. I mean, I was just reading this morning about a city that added an inclusionary zoning ordinance for building an ADU. And I think it was Healdsburg. So if you don't do if you do an ADU and it's not low income, then you have to pay a $20,000 fee for an ADU.
Yeah.
And so the legislature is probably going to have to act on something like that. But I mean, there's 500 cities and 58 counties, right? So there's going to be different things everywhere. I think at the end of the day, I think that there needs to be sort of I think the state needs to align its policies. And I might have said this last time. I've felt this way for a very long time, but it's not just about building housing. I mean, if we're serious about reducing, for example, the carbon footprint, then we have to decrease VMT. Well, you decrease VMT by actually, building up in the inner core and the urban centers
Correct.
and things like that, and putting resources into that. But right now, you're kind of requiring these cities out in the middle of nowhere to build housing. And I think that's fine, but it's not, it doesn't align all the other policies. How are you going to do, for example, transmission lines to power all this stuff that we're going to need in the future, but you can't get CEQA exemptions to build,
Right.
additional electrical lines, right? So we never align policies here. We just look at it as like one, let's solve housing. Well, it's a lot bigger than that, So I think the housing in general is not a partisan issue. Assemblymember Hoover and I mean, we routinely work with our colleagues on the other side, and that's where the friction is, by the way. On the other side of the aisle, between the environmental crew and then the sort of pro housing crew, and then Republicans sort of work with that. So that is definitely a bipartisan or issue that we work on. And so there's always promise on the housing front. It's aligning it with the other policies in the state
Right.
that are really impeding, the Howard. Also, by the way, these programs to help people buy homes. I mean, I think philosophically I'm okay with that, but when the average price of a home in California is like $700,000 or whatever it is, 800 now. I don't even know what it is, but
I think it's 900 over
Yeah.
900,000
It's crazy.
median home price.
That's
now.
insane, right? I mean, we have to address that issue in the first place, and there's so many factors that go into that. But building more housing can bring down the prices. I
Right.
acknowledge that, right? But you have to build a lot of housing to substantively reduce that price. So,
Assemblymember Hoover, any?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe hit on most of the points. I mean, I think, we have a lot of work to do in California when it comes to housing. And, unfortunately, there are a lot of anti-housing forces in the state.
Correct.
And so, I think finding the proper balance between local control and building, and then also just, I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to reforming things like CEQA, things
Right.
that, really the legislature has not shown a willingness to touch. I think Governor Jerry Brown in like 2014 or something famously called it the Lord's work, right, to reform the CEQA process, the California Environmental Quality Act. Well, unfortunately, it never got done. And the only thing we've been able to really do is kind of chip away with these exemptions, right? But I think we need to see a, more substantial reform there and really get to the core of the issue that's keeping us from meeting our housing goals.
Right. And I think you mentioned the chipping away. Generally, we've seen that in a lot of the housing or infill development. Is that typically where you're seeing the CEQA exemptions pop up?
I mean, yeah, it's always some kind of special program or something. I mean,
Right.
I had a fee deferral bill that oddly I got out of the assembly. I was actually surprised. I mean, it was a it was a fee deferral bill that just helped bring down, the upfront costs of building housing, whether it's an individual or a master
Right.
developer. And we got out of the assembly, it gets to the Senate, and it was modified, but it ended up being modified to a bill to where, and it actually went to another author at the end of the day, that only applied to certain housing projects, whether it's affordable or certain types of construction, things like that. And I think, look, we can keep taking little bites at the apple, but I don't think that's not going to do it. We got to have some major reforms, not just on housing. I mean, good Lord, when you look at all the issues in California, I mean, we need like substantial reforms.
I also just wanted to add this point about VMT, right? Like, I think this whole thing is becoming increasingly silly from the standpoint of, as our state, including our state government, but especially in the private sector, continues to embrace things like remote work. We're very stuck in this old mindset where everyone is traveling to the urban core to go to work and everyone has to go downtown every day. And that's just not happening to the same level that it used to happen. I think we do need to build more housing in all of our different communities and really just embrace like the future of work, which we haven't really adjusted our thinking on yet.
That's actually my pet thing, which is I feel like we should be almost encouraging more remote work because, you mentioned, for example, median home prices where you represent, even though they're high for the region, they're not high statewide.
Yeah.
Sacramento area, if we really should be encouraging people to move where they build housing, it's more affordable. And even if you have to go into work 1 or 2 days a week, that's doable.
So don't disagree with what you're saying. I mean, I'm always good with remote work, and a lot of, we represent a lot of state workers, right? I mean, if people want to work from home, and I used to work for the state too. It probably doesn't really matter at the end of the day, where you perform your job.
Right.
Although most successful people, I guess wealthy people say like, you got to go into the office to actually experience and have those water cooler talks and things like that. But another thing is a lot of people don't have the luxury of working from home.
Oh, right.
And that's what drives me nuts, especially when you look at things like the Coastal Act, like the people who clean the houses or work at McDonald's or, serve food, things like that. They have to live in inland communities because they can't afford to live in Santa Monica or whatever. And that drives me nuts that we don't create avenues. And it shouldn't be up to subsidies. It shouldn't be up to government paying for that. How about we get out of the way, let people actually live there, Yeah. Sorry, that was a detour.
So both the districts you represent and where I live, we're building lots and lots of housing. Why do you think we succeed in our areas? And I'll start with Assemblymember Hoover.
Well, look, I mean, when it comes to our communities, I mean, I do have one city that's pretty landlocked that isn't growing very much anymore. But then we have a couple cities that are actually expanding very quickly, and obviously some unincorporated communities that are continuing to build as well. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a commitment by those local governments, right, to actually allow for construction and building in our cities. We obviously care very strongly, and I think the community cares very strongly about building in a smart way. Implementing smart growth where we have the water necessary for this new housing. We have the money for the infrastructure. The traffic mitigation is a huge challenge in some of my cities where We're still struggling. We're trying to put together the dollars to actually build the freeway off ramps that we need for the future,
Right.
and the arterial streets and roads to help traffic flow smoothly. Those are challenges you have to do. Otherwise, it's not going to be a good experience. But I would say that our cities have shown a real commitment in my district to not just building, but doing it in a smart way.
Correct.
And I think we have to do that, because if you don't do that, then you lose the community. And I think it's really important that, the community is on board with any future growth. But it's really easy to be against new housing. The city I
Right.
grew up, I think, where we live, the city of Folsom is, it used to be a lot smaller than it is today, right? It's grown substantially since I was a kid, since my family moved there in the late 1990s. And so, I think for some people that's frustrating because the city has kind of gotten a lot bigger. On the other hand, I have a colleague running for city council in Folsom that always says, there was probably a time when someone was saying they shouldn't build my house, So at the end of the day, right, if we do it in a smart way, I think it's important that we're providing these opportunities, because I want my kids to be able to raise their kids in
Right.
California, right? When they get older, I want them to be able to afford a house to attain that California dream of home ownership. And I think the only way to do that is to increase the supply.
Assemblymember Patterson.
Well, I pretty much agree with everything he said. Same thing in Rockland, for example, where I live. If you ask any generation of people 5 years apart, it's like, I remember when that wasn't there. I remember when my house wasn't there when I used to live in Lincoln, right? But I think at the end of the day, the reason why these communities are building, I think we live in amazing communities, but any home builder will tell you it's because the land acquisition cost, right, is lower in these areas than it is, doing an infill project in Sacramento. Even if all the requirements are waived and everything, it's much easier to go out to, where you're not doing those sorts of things. And so I think the economic conditions really are the impetus for that, and the ability for people to actually buy those homes. Is pretty important. That's what brought me back. Actually, my wife and I made a huge mistake of moving to the Bay Area for a couple of years, and we were looking for homes. Both had good jobs, looking for homes, and we'd look at it and say, okay, we can move back to Placer County, have better schools, cheaper house, still have about the same income. What are we going to do? And so that's what we did, and the best decision we ever made was moving back.
Now, I'm going to get to something you just mentioned, Assemblymember Hoover, is that it needs to be done in a smart way. So in a sense, in both your communities, in both areas, there has been sufficient local buy-in, basically, to continue growth, as opposed to getting enormous. There's probably always going to be some resistance, of course, but that there's basically a buy-in. Why do you think, and I'll just pick two cities, Folsom, there's been an extensive amount of development going there, and yes, I'm a member of the various Facebook groups, and I see the people are really angry about it. But basically, most people seem on board. And why do you think that's been successful in maybe Rockland or Roseville, in your case, Assemblymember Patterson, to see how it seems like it continues to grow, and there seems at least to be continued local buy-in with that. So let's start with Assemblymember Hoover.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Rockland's only been successful since Joe left. I just want to be.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah.
No, but seriously, I think in the city of Folsom, I think Folsom has developed a track record of doing it well, right? And I think, when you look at the communities that Folsom creates, they've always ended up making the city better. And, you're always going to get some pushback. And I do understand this desire to keep the small town feel. I completely get that. I think that the reality is that there's just a lot of people in California, and our communities are very popular places, right? And they're popular because we've done such a good job governing them. We've done a great job, having great schools and making sure that our kids are being educated well. And so there's a lot of reasons to want to live in our community, and so that does push demand, but. I think the city council's just done a fantastic job over the years, and the developers to a degree, of making sure these communities are improving upon the community. And whether that's a multifamily housing project, whether those are single family housing projects, they always bring new life to the city and new opportunities, right? I mean, we didn't have an In-N-Out in Folsom until, maybe 6 years ago or something. And that was a huge deal.
Mhm.
Well, you don't get an In-N-Out in your community unless you have the traffic to support an In-N-Out, right?
Right.
That's the reality of it. And so as we have continued to grow, we have continued to see these new opportunities, new shopping opportunities, and all kinds of different things in the city that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I think overall, to your point, the community is on board. But I think we need to be careful, right? We need to be careful with that continued build out, continuing to do it in a smart way, and continuing to get that buy-in so that we don't lose the general public.
Assemblymember Patterson.
Yeah, I think Josh hit the nail on the head. I mean, when you look at Roseville, I'm just going to use them as an example. It reminds me in many ways of Folsom, but I mean, Roseville has absolutely exploded.
Oh yeah.
But the other day I was at my son's football game, and I had to drop him off, way too early before the game. And so I didn't really have anything to do. So I say, you know what, I'm going to go on a jog. And I just popped on this trail, and I could have went down the trail for miles. I mean, Roseville has just done such a great job at interconnecting the community, and really what they've done in terms of adding the quality of life. And I think that's what's really important as communities build out, is that it is always the push, you have the push and pull with, well, you don't want to put too much on the developers where they can't build homes anymore, right? If we're really trying to address the housing issue. But at the same time, people want to move to places now where they have a quality of life, where they can be a part of the community. And that's different for different communities. In Sacramento, it might be DOCO, right? Downtown Commons, right? In terms of creating the sense of community. But in Placer County, it might be creating trails and open spaces and things like that, where people can kind of get away from DOCO,
Right.
So,
Right.
but I think whatever the culture of the community is, I think when people move there, they're buying into that. And I think as that goes on, I think people can kind of accept it, but you do have to be careful to make sure you keep that going. And I've seen some communities, even when I was on the Rockland City Council, I'd say, hey, look, our trail system, for example, just to give an example, is
Right.
not as nice. And I'm a little jealous of that, right? Because I would love to connect our trails together
Oh, I see.
and just
Right.
have this massive trail system in Placer County. And maybe one day that'll happen, but that would add to the quality of life and bring economic development with it.
Right. And then also potentially increase the buy-in to more development.
Exactly.
Because you're
Yeah.
keeping the quality of life. Thanks. Now, homeowners insurance remains a crisis for many in the state, and I think increasingly in parts of Folsom, even we're starting to see fair plan only communities, and I'm sure in parts of definitely in Placer County, you're seeing fair plan only communities. Assemblymember Patterson, you're part of the insurance committee. Thoughts?
Well, I think I might be the only member of the Assembly Insurance Committee that actually lost their insurance, and I live in Rockland. So my insurer, and it was a smaller one, but they're exiting the state completely. So I understand all the frustration that people are having, and we're looking for what our option's going to be, and especially in El Dorado County, by the way. I mean, people just can't get insurance, and their fair plan is for them $10,000.
Right.
It might be cheaper in other parts of the state, right? But in my district, it's unaffordable. And so, what's really disappointing to me, though, is we went through an entire year in the legislature and didn't do diddly on it, nothing. And you bring proposals and say, hey, we should do X, Y, Z. And I'm not aware of anything substantive happening to solve the insurance. That now I do know the insurance commissioner is starting to take actions, and I'm cautiously optimistic about that.
Right.
I mean, and I've had conversations with him too. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic. It's not moving as fast as I like, but I think a lot of this does have to happen on the regulatory side of things, and I think you're going to start seeing that. But you have to work with the stakeholders, not just consumers, by the way. Insurers are private companies. They don't have to stay here, as they've evidenced already. So we have to solve that. But one thing I do want to say too is we're not the only state in the nation with this issue. If you Texas, the hail is bigger, and so they don't have the same kind of massive wildfires that we have, but they have these smaller incidents all over the place. magnified, and it's causing insurance issues there too. So it's kind of a broader conversation actually about the security of insurance in general.
Assemblymember Hoover.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave most of that topic to Joe, but I would share his frustrations with it. I've also had some conversations with the insurance commissioner, and while it's not as big of an issue in my district, it certainly is becoming one, right? We
Yeah.
are seeing some more non-renewals in my district, and my constituents are being forced to go find new insurers, which is really difficult, and can be very expensive. And so, I think at the end of the day, California is one of the few places in the entire country that doesn't allow for certain things, such as like forward-looking climate modeling, and we kind of we have a really problematic reinsurance market in California that needs to be fixed. We kind of have identified the problems. I think what we need to do now is identify the solutions, and I'm being told that the insurance commissioner is taking action this year on that, which is a good thing. But we have to remember that even once he does that, it's going to take time for those regulations to be drafted.
Right.
It's going to take time for those to actually impact consumers in a positive way. And so I think, to Joe's point, we need to move quicker on this. And I know that the Department of Insurance is this huge, behemoth of a bureaucracy, but they need to do a better job of getting this done as quickly as possible for the people of California. And, I'm really hopeful we'll have some new updates on that in the coming weeks.
Yeah, well, our association's basically been supportive of, what the commissioner's doing, the sustainable strategy, because we agree we need the forward-looking catastrophic risk modeling
Yeah,
ASAP. But also
100%.
going to what you're saying about it's a nationwide problem. At our national association, I was part of a talk. It was kind of East Coast, West Coast insurance, California and Florida, and I was like, "Whew, Florida! Wow, much worse than like
It's crazy.
their insurance situation is just like wow, so
It's
next
bad.
level." And it's not just their homeowners; they're overall like much more
Yeah.
problematic insurance than we do, and so that was kind of an eye opener.
Mhm.
It was kind of one of these things where I was like, okay, so nothing I've heard today changes my view. We're still better off than
Yeah.
Florida, and you're right; it's become a nationwide problem.
Yeah.
Well, and these are some major markets, right? It's not
Yeah.
like, I mean, I'm sure that insurance companies want to be doing business in these places, but we have to figure out this situation.
Yeah. No, and yeah, as I said, nationwide problem. When I went to some talk, they were talking about how the bridge disaster in Baltimore was going to be
Oh, yeah.
rippling through the whole insurance industry because of the reinsurance and all the billions of losses. And I was like, oh boy,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it's a messy issue. Um, so your experiences in both local and state governments, I'm sure you've seen, we've talked about locals pushing back against state mandates. Is there a way for the state to work better with local governments, you think, or is this always going to be the state trying to push, locals resisting? What could, instead of just carrot stick, is there a way we could mediate that a little better? And I'll start with you, Assemblymember Patterson.
It's always really hard to characterize a situation again because you have 500 cities and dozens of counties, right, that all approach things different ways.
Mhm.
And so it's really hard to figure out the right approach. I mean, just when you look at the housing element process and the RENA process for
Right.
cities and things like that, I mean, it's, to me, I've said regularly, I think it's nonsensical, that just how it works in general. But I think cities also, I had a couple bills that, for example, the league was opposed to, and one of them just made completely no sense at all to me. And then started calling my city council members. So I had to call them and say, like, this is, this is what the bill does or
Right.
whatever. And then there really wasn't a concern. And then I worked with my cities, right, to get the situation fixed.
Oh, good. Yeah.
But I think it doesn't. I think we got to look at more of incentives to do certain things rather than if you don't do this, this is going to. I mean, we're just doing negative incentives right now. Like, hey,
Right.
let's give the attorney general more power to sue more cities. Like, that's really going to create a good relationship. That's why I oppose a lot of these bills to give the attorney general more authority. Not all of them, but most of them, because I don't think that that's the right approach to incentivize. I think we could do things like, transportation funding, for example, or where we make investments based off certain things. And some cities might say, we don't really care we're good with what,
Right.
we don't want the transportation dollars, right? And the federal government does that. Federal government gives money to people or jurisdictions who kind of do whatever they want to do. And plenty of states are just fine saying, "No, we're good."
Right.
Right. And they get around just fine. So I think we need to look at more of that kind of approach than let's just sue everybody and give criminal penalties to people too. That's just making everybody mad. And I think it's a bad approach.
Assemblymember Hoover.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, I think we need to find a way to work more productively with our cities. I mean, the reality is we've already kind of talked about it. There's a lot of cities that are doing good work on this, right? So certainly finding ways to reward those cities and yeah, just positively incentivize building. But when you really look at it, and I mean, I'm sure Joe would be happy to rant on this one as well. I mean, I think some of our problems are even beyond local governments, right? I mean, some of the issue comes down to things like the Coastal Commission, right, where you have a state entity that is a giant barrier to progress on the housing front in a really important and impactful part of our state. Those are some of the issue areas where I would like to see the legislature take a bigger role. I think we can work productively with our cities and with a few exceptions, right? But I think there are other barriers in place that I think we should be focused on as well, that I think need to be addressed pretty, even more importantly.
Now, the election coming up, as if you could talk about a bit about Proposition 33. C.A.R. is a strong opponent of Proposition 33, which would, in our view, eliminate a lot of homeowner and impact private property rights with the possibility of extreme rent control. Can you share your positions on Prop 33 and your views, Assemblymember Patterson?
I mean, how many times are we going to do this? How many times does it need to be voted down to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation to realize that Californians don't want it? So, yeah, I'm against rent control. I used to, when my wife and I moved to the Bay Area, we had to rent out what our primary residence was. And obviously, depending on what model if one gets brought in on rent control basis, and already just the difficulty of a small landlord to a person who all my assets were wrapped up in that house. All the things on background checks and how those have to lawfully be done and how you pick who can live there and all those sorts of things. That's very complicated for a person who has all their assets tied up there. And then now you want to potentially add rent control to certain categories. It's not rocket science. People aren't going to invest in things where there's a massive amount of risk if the profit, if any, is going to be capped at some point. It's really pretty obvious, should be pretty obvious to people. So I'm opposed to it. I can't wait to vote no. And I think I've already submitted opposition support things for both, or opposition things for both of them. But just a waste of time. Can we stop putting that on the ballot?
I know. Number 3, Assemblymember Hoover.
I mean, it's hard to follow that. I mean, my constituents voted almost 70% opposed to this last time it was on the ballot. I mean, this is just such a strongly opposed notion in California. It's economics 101 too, that we know that it doesn't work. And I think that's the frustrating thing is when you look at, capping rent control, what we usually see happen in those situations in the cities that have tried it is you actually see a decrease in housing supply.
Of course.
If you have a decrease in housing supply, you generally have an increase in cost of that housing. I mean, it's truly economics 101, and we're doing the opposite of what we need to be doing. The other thing, that you have, because I have family that is, invested in small rental properties, but you right now you have a quality and robust market of mom and pop rentals, right? Mom and pop landlords that want to work with their tenants, that want to have good relationships with their tenants, and work with them on prices and all of that stuff. The more that we push things like rent control, the more we push those people out of the market. The more, I think burdens that we place on them. Those are the people we want renting houses to our constituents, right? And the more that we place burdens on them, I think, the more likely it is that they're going to get out of the market and probably hand those over either, to home buyers or to corporate interests. And I don't think that's in the best interest of tenants. And so, at the end of the day, I fully expect this will be rejected again. But I just am trying to urge, people that I know that ask me, or my constituents, or my, community, that this is going to take us in the wrong direction. And yeah, really hoping that California comes through and opposes this again.
Yeah, third time, and as you mentioned, especially even some state legislators who might normally support maybe rent control in their local communities have come out opposed, because it's basically so far-reaching. By repealing Costa-Hawkins, you potentially could have severe negative impacts on any housing development. So you've actually had a kind of unusual, this time, coalition of even legislators who normally might not be opposed to this coming out opposed. It's quite interesting.
I know a lady who lives in a rent-controlled unit in a coastal city, and it's just rent-controlled based off of, if you live there, it can't go up more than a certain amount,
Correct.
per year. And she will never move. Why would you ever move? So, and then what happens is other people can't move in as population's growing. And then now she doesn't need another place to live because she's just going to stay there forever, right? So
Right.
it just creates this system of by the way, she's benefiting, right? And all these other people who could have a place to live or whatever, they're not. And it's just,
Right.
it's like, give some to these special people who got the place on time, then they will never move, right? So
Yeah, it's also, as you both pointed out, economics 101. I mean, the most expensive rental cities in, frankly, the world in California are all rent control cities, right? I mean, San Francisco, Los Angeles, are some of the most
Weird how
expensive
that
cities
happens.
in the world.
Yeah.
And, it's also point out, because sometimes I'll look at materials and I'm like, always they'll be like economists. I go, put economists to the left and right. You have, Milton Friedman, deceased, but, excellent analysis of rent control. And you actually have Krugman, also opposed to rent control for all the basic economic reasons.
Yep.
I mean, it's hard to find somebody who on an economic basis would support it. But
No, don't let
100%.
the science get in the way of.
And as far as this is number 3. It's every 2 years industry has to come up with the resources to fight this back.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you for sharing your insights and expertise. On a lighter note, anything sort of fun from your session the last 2 years that you'd like to share? Anything that you found amusing or interesting? Doesn't necessarily have to be, could be anything like that.
I personally, what happens is all these meeting requests come in from constituents that I want to meet with, and then Sacramento people, and you have all these requests come in, and then you say, yes, I'm going to meet with this person. And then you wake up and you have your schedules like tomorrow, and my scheduler emails it to me the night before, like, you're doing all of these things. And I feel like every day is kind of a day where I'm just told where I need to go. And even though I said yes to all of them, it's kind of strange. Just you almost kind of lose control of your life a little bit, because you're scheduled out. And it's so interesting, just going to grab a beer with a friend or something. I'm like, well, let me ask my scheduler when I can go have a beer with you.
True.
I try not to tell them that, but I do actually have to go ask her, like, may I have permission to go drink a beer with my friend, please? So.
It is crazy when you show any of your friends your calendar. It's always like, do you actually work, or do you just meet with people all day? It's like, I pretty much just meet with people all day. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say it's just been a real honor getting to, be in this role, be a voice for the community. I've had, I think you have too, but I've had a couple opportunities to bring one of my kids on the floor and introduce them to my colleagues and kind of give them a little shout out. And that's just really special. That's been a lot of fun. They don't have any appreciation for it at all right now, but I think like,
Zilch.
So they're just like, whatever, Dad, But I think, someday maybe they will. But it's that's been pretty special It has been really interesting being a part of some votes that would not have happened otherwise without me.
Hmm.
And I would say that, for all the people that say Republicans don't matter in Sacramento, it's just absolutely not true. I
Right.
think Republicans were responsible for putting very substantial housing legislation out of the Natural Resources Committee last year. We were the deciding votes on critical housing legislation that moved forward. This year, Joe and I actually were the deciding votes on a bill to bring more safety to autonomous vehicles. There's just there are instances, right, on these issues that are less partisan for Republicans to have a real impact on making good policy. So that's been a lot of fun. And then I would say the funniest thing that has happened to me is there's this committee room on the fourth floor of the Capitol that they've started rebuilding the annex on the backside, and so they've had to board up a lot of rooms and stuff. So there's this escape hatch in the committee room that sends you out of this exit and around the corner so you can sneak out without really being seen. Turns out they boarded up that room, but they didn't lock the door.
Oh.
So I literally got up to leave a committee hearing. This was like a week ago. And I walked into that room and it locked on the way coming out. And I was locked in a box just in the state capitol. So don't go in there. But I'm like in committee, like knocking on a door to try to have someone let me out of the room. And our chair, Isaac Bryan, who's one of our colleagues, kind of was joking with me that he had created that trap for Republicans, so that they could capture some of us and keep us from voting. But
he's a targeted seat. That was no accident.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a good point. So it was just, but just a real honor, honestly, to be in this job and to represent the district, and excited for what's to come in the future.
Actually, that your Assemblymember Patterson, your mention of targeted seat just made me think of something, which is you both are up for election in November. I think it's fair to say, Assemblymember Patterson, you represent a deeper red Republican district, and Assemblymember Hoover, I think it's fair to say, a fairly purple district.
Absolutely.
How does that impact your, I guess, re-election efforts and strategies, Assemblymember Patterson?
I mean, we could do a whole show on that, just that question, to be honest with you. But, it gives me, I always look at the election and what my opponent's doing and what's going to happen out there. But I've always just figured, I do a lot of these podcasts and things because I just figure I want to be as authentic myself as I can and show up to events. I don't show up to events because it's a good political reason. I show up to events because I care. And I always figure if I do a good job doing those sorts of things, then I'm going to be reelected. And by the way, there have been many people with similar positions as me that have had the kind of voter registration advantages that I've had, and that's gone away very, very quick. So it's always in the back of my mind that things can change very quickly. But I've always figured if I go out and do the best I can, and if I lose one day, I guess, that's fate, but I'm just going to do the best I can while I'm in office. And I sweat about the election every now and then, but I don't really lose sleep because I do the best I can, and that's all I can really do.
Assemblymember Hoover?
I don't think he actually sweats that much, but
not as much as this guy. This guy sweats.
He doesn't know what sweat is. No, I'm kidding. But look, the way I approach the job, look, you can never take it for granted, right? It is every day. I think it's an opportunity to do something good for your district, your community. And I think people are overall really tired of partisan politics. I really believe that across the board, even if you're a Republican or a Democrat, there are people that are they want someone that's just going to show up for them and fight for their values, right? And so I really try to approach the job in a way where, I'm representing the whole community to the best of my ability. Democrats, Republicans, independents, no matter who it is. And I think that is, at the end of the day, really the values that I try to have at the state capitol. I had a woman come up to me at a community meeting in Citrus Heights a couple days ago, actually, and tell me that she had completely sworn off the Republican Party, will never vote for another Republican, but that she's going to vote for me this cycle because she thinks that I focus on the right things, that I focus on the issues impacting the community, not so much all the partisan politics that are going on in the nation. And so And I really think at the end of the day, that is our job. Our job is not to, get wins for a particular political party. It's to get wins for our district and our constituents. And so I think that's kind of how I try to frame it. And hopefully that, helps at election time, but really it's just about doing the job. I think we're not guaranteed any time here, right? Ever,
Right.
having to earn these jobs every 2 years. And so just while you're here, you need to do the best job you can do.
Okay. Thank you both for joining us, and maybe we'll see you again in next year and for another visit here at the podcast. That'd be great.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.